Hello and welcome to That Bible Guy. I was sent this objection yesterday that undermines the book of James. And first viewing this, you would think that this undermines the book of James because it was written before this council where things had changed, and how can we trust what James is saying? So let's just ask ourselves three things on this video. And I did this yesterday when I seen this video. I thought the first thing, what is the actual objection? I've kind of already said it. It's the idea that because James was written before this council happened, and there was disagreement between him and the other apostles, you can't really trust what he's saying because of the date that it was written on in Acts 15 being later on. So that was the first thing. That's the argument. Can we trust James? That's the big question. Second thing then is, well, what about the facts? Are the facts correct in what they're saying here? Well, yes and no. Yes, they're right. James was written between AD 45, AD 48. So it was written before Acts 15. The events taking place, which is around AD 50, Council of Jerusalem. So those facts are right. There are facts that are not right, and they're implied and they're assumed in this video. And that's you'll see the statement that because of the other apostles disagreeing with James, and he wrote around that time when they disagreed before the council changed things, you can't trust what he was saying because of when it was written. Yes, the dates are right, but the assumption is not right. The reality of all of this is there was no contradiction between what James thought and wrote at any date and the other apostles, and specifically maybe Paul. And that obviously came out in Acts 15. There was no contradiction. This contradiction is between law and grace, and it's all to do, works and grace. It's all that comes down to the time of the Protestant Reformation, the debate between how do we harmonise what Paul wrote and what James wrote. Well, as I say, there is no dispute. Paul did have major disputes with Peter, where he did draw back at one time, and then later on he had a dispute with Barnabas about having to bring Mark along. So Paul did have disputes with people, but it wasn't with James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem here. It does talk about Peter withdrawing at one time because people came from the house, the work came from James, if you like. But it didn't say that James sent them. He didn't send them saying that everyone must become Jews and commit the works of the law. And how do we know this? Well, you read Acts 15 and you read James's position, which is simply that Peter stood up. We shouldn't make the Gentiles do all these things to become Jews. James agreed with him, and he was a spokesman for the church. So he laid out what he really thought at that point, meaning he wouldn't have been the man to send other people to make them become like Jews. So he clarified his position in Acts 15 there. The other thing about Paul and James then, to harmonise, to show that there is no conflict, is that they're writing to different audiences and have different ministries. Paul was writing to the Gentiles, and that was his mission. He said it himself. And then James was writing as the leader of the church, most often to the Jews. So they're writing to a different audience. And there's a different context then to what you're trying to say. But there's no contradiction. And here's a really clear point that really helps me with this. Understand that there was never a contradiction between what James wrote and Paul wrote, or between James and the other apostles about works and grace. When James was writing, he was writing to clear up the wrong view of faith. And Paul was writing to clear up the wrong view of works. So Paul was saying, look, your works aren't going to save you. They're works of the law, he would always term it. And he was saying they don't save you. Then James was addressing the other people and saying, well, if you have, say you've got faith, intellectual, yeah, the demons have that faith, but you don't do anything about it, then that's not right. And Paul would agree with him. Paul said, how do you prove your repentance? By your deeds. He writes repeatedly in Romans that we call on the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith. Obedience is presupposed when the term faith is used. Obedience is always presupposed. Read Hebrews 3 if you want to get a bit of insight on that. So there is no contradiction. Paul talks about it. There's no contradiction between Paul and James. There's no contradiction between James and the apostles. And as far as I can see it, there never was. So when he wrote and the council took place, James, we don't have this evolution of James's view at any point, and therefore we can trust what he wrote in James, and we can trust what was written in the book of Acts.